Hi everyone. So just admitting the last couple of people. Yeah, so we should. Yeah, so I'm sure Simon can take over admissions now. So thank you everyone for attending this memorial to Neil Faulkner. I want to thank the speakers who are going to sort of be presenting short speeches, sort of on Neil from sort of different perspectives on his life. And the family for attending as well. His partner Lucy and his children Rena, Tiggy, and Finian, who I think are here currently. And we're going to sort of be going through a set list before we open up contributions from the floor. So I will be doing the chairing for the set list, which includes clips from Neil from sort of various different on various different topics, and the speakers will obviously be giving their own perspectives on Neil. I first met Neil on a Saturday at the Friend's house in London at a courtyard with a group of other socialists. It was a bit noisy and cold there, so we quickly moved to the Marlborough Arms in Bloomsbury, and from there to somewhere else. But over these various meeting points, we hashed out what became Mutiny, which eventually ended up joining ACR. Since then, Neil was nothing other than an inspiration to me, and as he was to many others. I'm just going to quickly read a quote from his last book on the mass psychology of creeping fascism, in which he quotes Erich Fromm about what the ideal life looks like. That's sort of what Neil Fromm's talking about, and I think it's a very apt description of how Neil inspired others to be, and how he was himself. And Neil Fromm, Erich Fromm was talking about love in a sort of social context, and he says, "Love is an activity, not a passive effect. It is a standing in, not a falling for. In the more general way, the active character of love can be described by stating that love is primarily giving, not receiving. Giving is the highest expression of potency. What does one person give to another? He gives of himself, of the most precious he has. He gives him of that which is alive in him. He gives him of his joy, of his interest, of his understanding, of his knowledge, of his humor, of his sadness, of all expressions and manifestations of that which is alive in him." I'm going to be first turning to a clip from Phil Hurst, which he supplied ahead. Phil Hurst worked with Neil in Mutiny. He co-authored System Crash and Creeping Fascism with Neil, and established ACR with Neil, as well as collaborating closely in many articles. And with that, I'll turn to Simon, who can play the first clip.
Okay, so Neil's death is a tremendous loss, a tremendous tragedy, of course, for his family and for the ACR. I'd just like to reiterate the welcome to Lucy, his partner, and any other of his family who may be present. Of course, it's a great tragedy for them, but for the ACR, it's an enormous tragedy because we have lost our best speaker and our most dynamic political thinker, someone who is a tremendous asset in the ACR leadership and in its public activities. In my obituary for Neil, I said that he was a charismatic revolutionary. Charismatic because he had an amazing ability to attract people politically, and that ability to attract people politically, of course, was in part because of his personal qualities, his humour, and his ability to share a joke at his own expense, but also his ability to locate political developments in their historical context and explain these things clearly and understandably to people who are not familiar with Marxist ideas. A few decades ago, when I was coming into politics, someone said to me that the art of revolutionary leadership is the ability to develop other people politically. And Neil had a tremendous ability to do that. And it was all grounded in his understanding of history, which of course is the core historical materialism of the Marxist method. Neil, after university, went to work for anti-apartheid. He came into politics through the Anti-Nazi League, and it's these themes of anti-racism and anti-imperialism which you can see throughout his work. When he started writing his books in the mid-1990s, already, although it was about ancient history, the theme of imperialism was there loud and clear. A good friend of mine, who many people here will have known, called Dave Packer, said to me before I knew Neil, I've just heard this guy, brilliant speaker at the SWP's Marxism event, talking about the Roman Empire, but he's got a crazy theory that the Roman Empire wasn't a slave society, a slave mode of production. It was robbery with violence. And actually, when you think about it and you follow what actually the Roman Empire was all about, well, it may have been an iconoclastic way of posing the question, but it was spot on, robbery with violence. And it was spot on about British imperialism, and it's spot on about imperialism today. The term robbery with violence, mega violence, would have been perfectly understandable to the people resisting in Ukraine today. Neil really didn't sort of come into political leadership roles until the beginning of this century, the noughties. And he was a member of the SWP for 30 years, and he expressed his politics, yes, through participation in union and normal political activity, but not at a leadership level, and through the development of his archaeological skills and abilities, and through the beginning of the writing of the books about history and eventually about imperialism. And it was really only, I would say, after the economic crisis 2007, 2008, that Neil comes into political leadership much more clearly, because he could see the tremendous crisis that it was beginning to unleash at a world scale. And we know that that economic crisis has merged today with the environmental crisis and with the pandemic, and with other developments, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And his position as a growing political leader really led him to leave the SWP and eventually break with Counterfire. And by 2014, Neil was the leading figure in the Brick Lane debates. And this was where Neil felt most at home and which most enthused him, talking about politics and theory to young people, explaining Marxism to them. There are some videos of him that you can find on the Brick Lane sites, which are still up there, explaining to them, if somebody tells you that Marxism is outdated, just look at the crisis today. It was that enthusiasm for the mobilization of young people and winning them to revolutionary politics, which made him tremendously enthusiastic about the Black Lives Matter movement, both in the United States and in this country, but also the Extinction Rebellion movement. And also Neil was at the big Black Lives Matter demonstration in London. He was also at the rally protesting the murder of Sarah Everard, which was so brutally attacked by the police. And Neil was Neil thought that this was the beginning of a new feminist movement based on young people. He began in about 2016-17 on a kind of theoretical odyssey, together with other people in first of all in Left Unity, then the AC, to attempt to understand what was going on in the world today and the massive changes which we've seen in the massive crisis. And the core of this, of course, for him was Creeping Fascism. His book, which he wrote with different people, 2 different editions of the book, and the emergence of right-wing authoritarianism and clear fascism, the results of which we are seeing in some kind of way in the Ukraine, because actually the regime is much more easy to see this now in Europe, which is closest to fascism, is the Putin regime in Russia. And the threat of fascism and right-wing authoritarianism has not gone away and persists in Europe, in Latin America, and will persist very much if Donald Trump, as is quite possible, is elected president in 2004 in the United States. Neil began to work with William I. Robinson in the United States, and with comrades in the ACR, about how all these things fitted together, especially about how the environmental crisis fitted together with the pandemic, how the economic crisis fitted together with creeping fascism, and how all these things were leading to the emergence of a surfeit of state and international violence, what William Robinson calls accumulation by violence, the mega violence, the increased militarization, which we see throughout the world today. Neil had a tremendous ability to mobilize and inspire not just young people, but older comrades who were trying to wrestle with these political and theoretical questions, and help together with them to work out things in a new way, not just to repeat the old theories of Marxism, the old theories of Marx and Engels and Lenin and Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg, all of which remain in their own way valid, but to see that something has changed greatly and that it is urgent that we recruit young people to the cause of revolutionary Marxism and build broader movements of the oppressed, of Black people, of women and young people, to begin to confront this crisis from a progressive and revolutionary point of view. Neil was our best speaker in the merger of mutiny and socialist resistance, which formed the ACR. Neil gave us all a shot in the arm, you might even say a kick in the pants. People began to think about things in new ways, to be inspired, to be active again, and to see the possibility of building a revolutionary alternative. We will miss Neil tremendously. We will miss him personally, and all of us do every day. We will miss him personally. We will miss him.
So, thank you. Apologies for the slight issues with sound. If you're having issues hearing, look at the Zoom settings, and you can sort of turn your output to the max. Alternatively, if you're on a laptop, it's sometimes an issue with Zoom, I gather. Plugging in a headphone can help the situation, since laptop speakers can sort of be not great on Zoom. But I hope you're all able to hear the clips, and it's amazing to see so many people turn up. I just saw Chris Jones comment on the chat about seeing Neil arguing in Shrewsbury Art Museum with another archaeologist about the nature of slavery, with the other archaeologist almost acting as if slaves were lucky to have the job in a and I remember very fondly when Neil debated, quote unquote, Julia Hartley Brewer on her talk radio show, and was incredible in terms of the way that he controlled the conversation and really left her speechless in his defense of the toppling of the Edward Colston statue. And I think he was always able to speak eloquently and powerfully in those contexts, and with a depth of humanity that I think would often surprise, especially sort of people coming from more reactionary traditions and backgrounds. Next, we're going to return to a clip from William I. Robinson. William I. Robinson is a professor of sociology at the University of California, and has multiple publications, including The Global Police State. He engaged in theoretical discussions with Neil that were published in a series of articles, and I remember quite fondly his appearances both for Mutiny and for ACR, where he gave quite popular sort of Zoom call lectures. So Simon, would you like to play the next clip? Oh, also, could you put the link to YouTube in the thank you. Yeah.
Well, good evening, everyone. I regret that I cannot join you live this evening. And I also, of course, regret the circumstances under which we're meeting. But we also want to remember that this is as much a celebration of Neil's life as it is a memorial that we mourn. I've prepared a brief eulogy, and I would like to read it to you. In 2015, I discovered Neil's book, A Marxist History of the World, From Neanderthals to Neoliberals. I had not previously known of Neil, and so engrossing was this work that I devoured it in just a couple of sittings. It was clear to me that he was a brilliant historian, a brilliant committed Marxist, and a gifted writer. So it was therefore such a great privilege and a pleasure when Neil, together with Phil Hurst, reached out to me in early 2020. They had heard a couple of interviews in which I had spoken about capitalist crisis and about what I term 21st century fascism. And here the overlap was evident in our analysis with what the two of them were referring to as creeping fascism. So this first contact was the start of a tremendously rewarding intellectual and political exchange that was fast developing into a deeper collaboration at the time that Neil became sick. Over the next 2 years, I learned of the work of anti-capitalist resistance, and I had the opportunity to make a Zoom presentation and have a discussion with some of the anti-capitalist resistance comrades. I read many more of Neil's books, including A People's History of the Russian Revolution and Rome, Empire of the Eagle. When System Crash was published by a group from the anti-capitalist resistance, there was no doubt that we were on the same page with respect to our understanding of the crisis of global capitalism, militarized accumulation, or the concept of global police state, and the urgent political tasks at hand. Also in 2021, Neil and Phil sent me a draft of their theoretical work, Value and Surplus Through Neoliberal Lenses, which argued that we need to rethink the relationship between the labor theory of value and the laws that govern the creation and the circulation of value, lest we conflate two different registers of activities and levels of abstraction. While I had some minor discrepancies with some of the article, the piece was so provocative that it inspired me to undertake a new line of research into global production, circulation, and appropriation of values, and its implications for our understanding of radical transformations underway in global capitalism, especially through digitalization and financialization. I learned so much from Neil. His energy, commitment, and passion came through in the sheer tenor of his writings. And even from his hospital bed, he continued to elucidate us. He pounded out in what seemed to me like one sitting a lengthy analysis of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. I regret so much that Neil and I never had the chance to meet in person. Due to the pandemic, my wife and I had to cancel a late 2020 trip to Paris that would have taken us through a layover in the UK. Unfortunately, Neil passed before we could get to Europe and have the opportunity to have that meeting in person. But Neil's friendship and warmth as a human being came through in our email correspondence. Beyond his comradeship to so many, I can just imagine what a wonderful friend and family member he must have been to those who got to know him personally. We lost a dear friend and comrade. The global left has lost a titan. Let Neil's illustrious life and work inspire us to continue forward the struggle for socialism. The best we can possibly make to the life of this exemplary revolutionary is to renew our commitment to the quest for emancipation from exploitation and from human alienation. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. I think both William's video and Phil's video really eloquently and powerfully describe how Neil approached theory and how he approached political education and inspiring sort of people into theory and to sort of see it in practice, and that there was sort of no real divide for Neil, as I think there all too often is. Our next clip is going to be from Neil himself. It's from a speech around the World War I centenary, and I think gives an example of how Neil sort of wove together politics with history and understood both and understood history as a sort of foundation of political theory.
In a war in the interests of the bankers, the corporations, and the rich. And not just that war, because we are marking this evening the centenary of the beginning of the First World War, but also the centenary of the beginning of a century of war. A century in which more than 150 million people have died. A century of industrialized slaughter in the interests of the rich. A century of slaughter for empire and profit, because that is what the First World War was, and that is what so many of the wars since have been about. The bombs raining down on Gaza at the moment are part of the same system. The that produced the First World War. The bombs raining down are supplied by American arms manufacturers and British arms manufacturers and French arms manufacturers, and the word for that is imperialism. And the reason they arm and fund Israel is because Israel does their bidding in the Middle East, because Israel is the militarized watchdog of Western interests in the Middle East. And that creates a connection with the First World War, because the First World War created the Middle East of today. The same Western imperial powers that are intervening in the Middle East today created the Middle East in a great conflagration between 1916 and 1921.
Thank you. I think that speech very much captures how he, as I said, sort of wove together different time periods and understood contemporary politics. Our next live speaker is going to be, our first live speaker is going to be Seema Saida. Seema Saida worked with Neil at the Military History Matters journal and co-authored with him the book Creeping Fascism. She's now a part-time organizer for the Another Europe is Possible campaign. And can I just ask everybody who isn't speaking to make sure that they keep their microphones off, because I think it sometimes comes through. But thank you. And without further ado, Seema.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Hi, this is probably one of the hardest things I've ever been asked to do. I think for me, and I'm sure many of you who knew me and who've been involved in organising with Neil together with me know that Neil was a massive influence on my life. And many of you have already acknowledged how much Neil influenced young people. And sorry, it's just still really difficult to process. Losing someone who was so instrumental. It's really good to see that Neil's family are here as well. I think I've only ever really spoken to Lucy on the phone when I worked with Neil at Military History Matters, but I can only imagine how hard it is for you and for Neil's children as well to lose, and what massive impact he must have had on your lives, given that I only knew him for a few years, and even that was just massively life-changing. For me, Neil was like a father figure. I lost my dad quite early on in my life, and Neil was always there to support me at work, in politics, and he was always there to encourage me. And I felt like he saw things and potential that, I didn't even see in myself or really believe that I had. And Neil was always encouraging me to go forward and get involved in organising and writing. So we worked together on a second version of Creeping Fascism. And I just think that seeing the outpouring of grief and on social media, it's so clear that he had a similar impact for so many other people as well. And that's why he was such an amazing person, because I think it's very rare to meet someone who touches so many people's lives in such a profound way. And I think for him, it seemed to come really easily and really naturally as well. I think, Rowan, you were talking about giving and how love is about giving. And I think he was just one of the most generous people in that respect. And Dan, you said in the chat that he was such a great speaker and his analysis was so sharp, but he was never egotistical. And I always felt that. I felt like he was one of the most approachable people that I knew. So as was mentioned, I met Neil through work. I got a job working for Military History Matters magazine. And one of the reasons I was really interested in working for that magazine actually was because I read I read some of the features, and it had a huge anti-imperialist take. So I read a good feature that Neil had written on the First World War, and having assumed that a military history magazine would be jingoistic and very conservative, it was completely the opposite. And so I started working there, and then as soon as I started working there, Neil was quite unashamed about the fact that he was a Marxist. So one of my first emails I received from him, he was the editor of the magazine and I was the assistant editor, said, "I'm a Marxist, I don't believe in social hierarchies." And as he was the freelance editor, he wasn't my official line manager either. And I think that experience working with someone who was trying to implement Marxism in practice, as contradictory as that can be within the capitalist system, really initiated my deeper understanding of Marx and Marxism. I had studied it before at university and before like as a teenager, but at those times, I don't think I really grasped what Marx was trying to say. And being taught in an academic setting, I was always taught by academics that Marx was too teleological, and we had a very postmodern academic postmodernism had basically taken over the academy when I studied history. And so Marx was basically rubbished as someone who was too universalizing and whose theories didn't apply anymore to the 21st century, the post-World War order. And working whilst rereading Marx completely changed my perspective, because I realized that much of what Marx described in the Communist Manifesto and in Capital matched my own working conditions. And also then working with Neil and discussing politics with him as well, we both realized that we had very similar views on Brexit and the rise of the far right. So it was really around that time, 2017, 2018, that my politics was really formed and shaped. And what Neil kind of seemed to take from Marx was this relentless optimism and the ability of humanity to completely change the modern world and to shape the future. And completely contrary to the postmodern nihilism, Neil was relentlessly fighting for what he believed in. He was relentlessly fighting for the cause. And even though I was much, much younger than him, I felt like he had far more energy. And he was just this vivid, extremely alive person. And when I just saw that clip that you showed, it's just like he's in the room. It's like he's there. And I remember after he passed away, I was trying to process grief, because that's something I always find difficult. So I started writing something, and I wrote this. I wrote, "I loved Neil so much. Neil changed my life. He changed my life by his example and by his encouragement. He was one of the greatest people I ever knew. He was so vivid, so alive. He never wasted a minute. He saw things with clarity. He was fiery. He was passionate. He never gossiped. He was completely dedicated to the cause. He burned so brightly and intensely, it's almost as if it's impossible for him to die. It's like he's still here. His death has cast everything into light too. After we've been stuck for years in the blurry shadows and madness of this pandemic, our social ties dissolving, our political organizations fragmenting, our grasps on the old world we knew before fading, Neil always focused on what was important. And his passing highlights the brevity of life. So for me, it's a spur to be with and cherish the people that I love in my life, but also to move forward with organizing and to never give up in that sense. Neil was a relentless optimist, and he had the unique ability to inspire others around him with his optimism and motivate them to action. It was through him that Gramsci's famous adage was drummed into me: pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. It was mutual pessimism of the intellect that brought us together to work on the second edition of Creeping Fascism, What It Is and How to Fight It, published in 2019. The unbridled racism of the Leave campaign, the result of the referendum in 2016, the hurtling towards a hard Brexit in the ensuing years, and the abject failure of the left to collectively resist head-on the migrant scapegoating and xenophobia inherent in the Brexit vote motivated both of us to call for renewed left internationalist revolutionary organisation. We saw that the rise of the far right was a global phenomenon, with fascism showing its ugly face in Narendra Modi's premiership of India as head of the BJP, in Donald Trump's election victory in the US, in Orban's Hungary, in Bolsonaro's Brazil. The list goes on. Many of our predictions of the creep towards fascism by elected governments are now ringing true, especially with the Conservative government's current crackdown on protest, judicial scrutiny, elections, and refugees through the policing bill, the judicial review bill, the elections bill, and the nationality and borders bill. But Neil believed unwaveringly in the need for revolutionary socialist organisation to combat the rising far right. Till his last breath, he worked for that. He was an unashamed Marxist, but he was also deeply democratic. He despised the stifling, controlling nature of democratic centralism, railing against the bureaucratic, often bullying nature of certain political ways of organising on the left. But he also saw clearly the dangers of anarchism and the need for coherent organisation. His journey from the SWP through the Brick Lane debates and finally founding the anti-capitalist resistance was his attempt to forge effective democratic revolutionary organisation. Now he has passed away, his legacy will certainly live on, not least because of the huge number of young people he inspired. Huge numbers. That's what makes Neil's death so personal for me. I feel like he really saw me. I don't come from the wealthiest or most stable of backgrounds. I don't come from a family with a history of left organising. That world was a mystery to me, but Neil opened the door. He encouraged me and others in every way that he could, believed in me when I didn't. And so much of what I am today, I owe to Neil. And I'm not the only one who felt that way. So many of my comrades feel the same. His death has left an enormous hole for so many of us that will never be filled, but his memory will always be living the way he was, so vivid, so alive, so real, so energetic till his last breath. Neil was an academic, but more essentially, he was an activist. I'm sure he would approve of these closing words. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Seema. That was really beautiful. So I'm just video's going to switch over. Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Seema. That was amazing, and I'd echo all of the sentiments in that. It's a profound loss, and it's very hard to process still, definitely. Our next live speaker is David Castle, who worked with Neil through Pluto Press and produced a series of the Left Book Club with Neil, and to sort of offer another perspective. David Castle's going to be a video contribution as well, and the sound has been increased, so hopefully people will be able to hear. But that was a really moving speech. Thank you.
I first came across Neil, as many editors encounter their authors, over emails and phone calls as we discussed possible books he might publish through Pluto Press, where I've worked for almost 20 years. I got to know Neil better after the foundation of Counterfire in 2010, which he was a central member of for a number of years. We worked together at developing a Counterfire book series published by Pluto. Neil published a book within the series himself, of course, but I was very impressed by how he would develop the work of other younger writers, mentoring them, giving us time to work on their book proposals and manuscripts. As well as demonstrating a great generosity of spirit, Neil was also acutely aware of the need to bring on a new generation of political writers and activists. Rather than pushing himself forward to be widely recognized as a major left intellectual, which I think he was, he seemed more concerned in developing other people's abilities and confidence. Many speak of Neil's great revolutionary optimism. I found him to have exceptional political vision and to find insights and see possibilities long before others. One plan that was originally conceived by Neil developed into an organisation which I have been involved in now for almost 10 years, the Left Book Club. Neil first started talking to me about founding a book club modelled on the Left Book Club of Victor Gallant in early 2013. It would be a membership organisation with branches around the country, all reading and discussing the same book, one per month. He wanted to work with Pluto on this, but my Pluto colleagues and I were pretty sceptical, as were his then comrades in Counterfire. Book clubs had faded away over the past few decades, and we at Pluto couldn't see people sacrificing the choice they enjoy when entering a bookshop and seeing a whole array of books, for instead buying into a heavily curated list. But we were very wrong. Neil stuck doggedly with the idea and brought in Jan Wolfe, who shared his vision, and together they led the establishment of the new Left Book Club in 2014. Now the Left Book Club is thriving with 1,200 members and is doing all the things which Neil saw it could do, with local reading groups and political education programs. But it took the rest of us, except for Jan I should add, some time to catch up with his vision. Neil was absolutely invaluable during the early days of the Left Book Club. His clear-sighted political analysis of the current conjuncture ensured we focused on what was most needful and politically impactful. When factions emerged within the organisation, as often happens, Neil always kept a level head. He offered great leadership and presented a cool, considered assessment of the best way forward. And when the Left Book Club reached a point when it was handed over to others to run, Neil gracefully stepped back and dedicated himself to other political projects. I first got to know Neil as a Marxist historian, and that is probably how I know him best. Historians tend to specialise, often in quite narrow fields, but the breadth of Neil's work is astonishing. The First World War and the Roman Empire were areas where his knowledge was particularly deep, but he also wrote on the ancient Greek Olympics, the Russian Revolution, and the British Empire, as well as his directly political books on creeping fascism and the interlocking crises of the present. Neil was exemplary in knowing all the details, but not getting lost in them. He always focused on the big picture, the political structures and struggles, and the geopolitical forces at work. Pluto Press has published 2 books by Neil, A People's History of the Russian Revolution and A Radical History of the World, which was originally published in a shorter form as a Marxist history of the world. The Russian Revolution book is a very popular, fast-paced narrative account of the revolution seen from below. A Radical History of the World is a fantastic, jaw-dropping account of world history from Neolithic humans to the present day. I think it exemplifies Neil's exceptional ability to provide a bird's-eye perspective of history, drawing out the key political forces at work. I have never read anyone who can present such a sharply realised Marxist analysis within a gripping historical narrative. There have not been that many Marxist historians whose analysis is excellent and can also write scintillating prose. Against Neil's work, even the likes of Eric Hobsbawm and Christopher Hill can seem quite stodgy writers. Neil made a distinction between his political books, published by Pluto and Resistance Books and others, and his more mainstream books, which in later years were published by Yale University Press. But really politics, and particularly a focus on class struggle and the possibility of revolution, runs through his whole oeuvre. I haven't read it all, but I have read his Roman books, which are searing critiques of a militaristic, expansionist empire, which held the seeds of its own destruction through relying on new conquests to survive. I honestly have no idea how Neil did it all. Editing a bi-monthly military history magazine, acting as a super erudite tour guide of historical sites across the Mediterranean over the summer, the extensive work on digs in East Anglia and Jordan, and then the books, sometimes as often as a book a year, sometimes more. And then all the political organising on top of that. And he had his family commitments as well. It is formidable, something which ordinarily would be the achievement of many lifetimes. I remember Neil best holding forth at the Pluto office or in a Left Book Club meeting at Houseman's bookshop, people hanging on his every word. And the many private conversations where he would give his interpretation of the latest big political event or a new twist in the fortunes of the left. There was no doubting his charisma or his abilities, but I never saw any sign of arrogance in him. He would always muck in with everyone else and would share his time and knowledge with anyone who asked for it. Neil was extremely kind and also rather forgiving, a characteristic that perhaps we need more of on the left. There were people who had turned on him over the years, but I never saw him bear a grudge, never take it personally. He would always focus on what was needed politically and only dwell on feelings when he needed to defend those who were more affected than he. I was in touch with Neil very little over the last year of his life. He was writing a new book for Pluto, A People's History of the Spanish Civil War. I knew about his illness, and we had discussed how it would affect his writing plans. It is hard to believe that Neil has left us. He had such energy, so much life within him. He inspired and helped so many people around him. He had an impact on so many, and he lives on in all of us. And his words also live on through his fantastic books, which I hope will be read for many years to come. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really lovely as well, and I think the optimism that Neil embodied that came out in Seema's talk as well, and in William and Phil's speech. I think that was a really important part of what Neil contributed, and it's, I think, something the left struggles with in these crisis-ridden times, and is actually a real key crisis that we all face today. And I think Neil was uniquely suited to understand the sort of crisis of optimism and the need for optimism as something central to the life of the political left, but also, I think, life in general. So I'm just admitting people as I'm talking. The next piece we're going to play is another clip from Neil, and this one is going to see him in the role of as a Marxist historian, and I'll let Simon play that.
I'm in the Houses of Parliament, actually in St Stephen's Hall, which is built on the site where the House of Commons was meeting in 1642. Our leaders in Britain like to create the impression that Britain has always developed peacefully, constitutionally, but it wasn't like that on the 4th of January in 1642, when King Charles I came in at that end of the chamber with 100 officers, intent on arresting the leaders of the opposition. It was the beginning of an attempted military coup that triggered a revolution. This is John Hampden, one of the 5 members that the king had come to arrest. They weren't here. The king is supposed to have said, "I see the birds have flown." They were actually in the city of London. The city may be a centre of financial speculation and tax evasion today. It wasn't then. It was a centre of revolution, solid for Parliament. The citizens of London were hiding the 5 opposition members. They feared the royalists might try and break in. So the gates were closed. The people were preparing to defend the city against a royalist attack. The king had clearly lost control of his capital. Within 5 days, he was leaving to raise his standard at Oxford. The English Civil War had begun.
If you go to a big city like Paris, where there's been a great revolution, there's evidence of it all over the city. It's not like that here in London, where the revolution in the 17th century is virtually invisible. We're right in the heart of modern London here, and it's a huge urban sprawl. This was a village 350 years ago, and one of the biggest battles of the revolution happened right here. The revolution was hanging by a thread. The king had won the first battle, and if you'd looked that way on the 13th of November 1642, you'd have seen a royalist army of 12,000 soldiers making for London, and they could have crushed the revolution if they'd got through. But over on that side, 24,000 parliamentarian troops, many of them London militia, had massed to stop the royalists getting in. The parliamentarian army was too big. The line was too solid. The king decided he couldn't fight a pitched battle with any chance of winning, and London was saved for the...
Thank you. Thank you. It's really interesting because I used to live around that area, and Seema's got a lot of memories of that area as well, and it's really interesting sort of seeing it in that context. Our next live speaker is going to be Tansy Hopkins. Tansy Hopkins is a journalist and activist who worked with Neil through Pluto Press as he encouraged the publication of her work, The Anti-Capitalist Book of Fashion. And I think she's going to be a video. Okay, I'm sort of trying to work out whether they're live speakers or okay. Simon, do you want to play the clip? Thank you.
I'm recording this today because I'm going to be traveling on Sunday, and I just wanted to make sure that if I can't make it, that I get to send this message. I hope very much to be with you all on Sunday, and I wish we were meeting under happier circumstances. Since Neil died, I've been thinking recently about the role of a revolutionary in modern society, and I've been thinking that one of the roles that somebody like Neil had is to show people the possibility of a different way of life, a way of life that goes far above and beyond that of capital and profit, of constant crisis, of alienation and competition. A way of life that is not based upon capitalism, but instead upon commonality, real equality and shared ownership, harmony with the biosphere, peace, justice, art, craft, great learning, and of course, love. A way of life that's not based on delusion, but on the knowledge that human beings are at heart communal, and that this economic system is made up, and that it's we who have the power to reshape our world. I believe Neil had this revolutionary ability by the bucket load. He had it in his political beliefs, he had it in his archaeological work, and of course in his human interactions. And I believe that he showed so many of us the possibility of a different way. And he said to us all, take it and run with it. Neil was never stingy or miserly with his beliefs or with his time. He put as much time and knowledge as was needed to show this different way. After Neil died, a group of us from the Brick Lane debates gathered together to honour Neil's work and his friendship. We each wrote letters to him, thanking him for the role that he played in our lives. What was beautiful and notable was that when people read out loud their letters, they were saying the same kind of things, but in different words. That Neil was patient and kind and a good listener, that he had encouraged them and supported them to give public speeches, sometimes for the first time, and to run political events, that he made them feel seen as activists and individuals, that he was a genius who was nevertheless always ready to explain ideas until everyone understood, and in the way that he was gripped feverishly at times by this possibility of a different way and what was needed to achieve it. Neil's intellect, his generosity, his political drive, and his big heart lit up the world that we live in. Although we miss him greatly and all feel this deep sense of loss, I believe Neil left a powerful legacy, not just in his books, his videos, and his writings, but in these thousands and thousands of political seeds that he planted. It's now up to each of us in Neil's name and with this idea of a different world now to carry this love and spirit forward. Thank you so much, and we miss you, Neil.
Thank you, Tansy, for that wonderful talk. And quite recently, I was doing a workshop with Tansy that Neil had originally set up, and it really makes me sort of think about that impulse he had to encourage people to participate fully in organization and to engage with people, but also put them on a platform and elevate them. And I think that was a remarkable quality, and all too often missing from the left. He was always very attentive to building people up into being able to take on roles within organizations. And I think there's been a lot of talk about legacy, and I think that's very appropriate. And I think Neil has left an incredible legacy. And the next clip we're going to look at is Neil talking about what are Marxist tasks today, and I think that really frames that discussion about what Neil wanted from the future.
In circumstances of their own choosing. We do make our own history if we organise, if we act, if we organise and act in a way which is effective. Why is the Marxist history of the world important? And I don't mean the book, I mean in a kind of generic sense. Why is it important to have a Marxist understanding of history? Because we need to understand the past in order to be able to act in the present so as to change the future. And I'm going to come back finally, next slide please, to this, my starting point, which is just to say something about how dangerous the times are. Again, I've touched on it already, and I want to say a little bit more about it. I mean, I think it is actually the worst crisis in human history. I think it's at that level. I think it's worse than the 1930s. It's worse than the 1930s, even on a narrow economic register. And that's because the mass of bad debt that is weighing down the global financial system is bigger relative to the size of the global financial system than was the impact of the 1929 Wall Street crash. The entire global financial system is effectively bankrupt and being propped up by massive, massive levels of state support, which is ongoing. Even in narrow economic terms, the scale of the crisis is massive. That crisis is tearing society apart. I mean, the 25, 30 years of neoliberalism since the 1970s have massively increased social inequality, but that is continuing to, indeed it's accelerated since the 2008 crash. I mean, that's the extraordinary thing. There's been an acceleration in the degree to which our side is having its living standards cut, and they are accumulating wealth at the top. So massive, massive social tensions are being created. But what happens in an economic and social crisis on this scale? The tensions between the great powers, the tensions between the different imperial systems intensifies, because when markets shrink, when great corporations face bankruptcy, when there is a struggle for access to scarce resources, there is a ratcheting up of the tension between the great powers and the militarization of the relationships between the great powers. It's quite clear in the way in which the United States is positioned, the declining imperial hegemon, the declining imperial superpower, the way in which increasingly it is projecting military power as a way of shoring up a crumbling economic position in the face of emerging rivals in the global, essentially in the global east. The possibility of further wars and more serious wars than we have seen so far is there. And there are these two elements that I think are new, that didn't really exist in the 1930s at all. One is that key resources are running out. Oil is running out. Gas may be running out. A whole series of key mineral resources that are vital for a range of industrial processes are running out, which means that there is intensified competition between the great powers for access to these resources, which is why the Middle East is so tense. It's why the Caspian Basin is so tense. This is an image of the of the Caspian Basin. It's why there are why there's a new scramble for Africa. It's because the different powers are competing with each other for control over these scarce resources, which are literally running out. And as that problem is added to the mix, there is also the problem that they are pumping more and more and more carbon into the atmosphere, such that the rate of global warming is speeding up, such that we are already experiencing the effects of climate change, freak weather, the flooding of certain areas, the way in which there's now actually an interaction between the cuts on the one hand and the growing threat represented by climate change on the other, with cuts in expenditure on flood defences at the same time as the risk of flooding is actually rising. This is completely new. This is new in the mix, and something which means that if nothing else happens, within 25 or 50, or possibly it's going to be longer, but certainly this century, there is the possibility that the whole basis of industrial civilization will collapse because the planet will burn. All of these things mean, I think, that we are probably looking at the greatest crisis in the history of humanity, which is going to play out over the next 10, 20, 30 years. Slide, please. And this is why I think history's most important lesson is that the future, even now, for the first time possibly in human history, whether there is a future, given the environmental degradation which is going on, will be decided by what we do. Where we have got to up until this point has been decided by what we do. The outcome of the crisis this time will be decided by what we do, just as the outcome of the crisis in the 1930s was decided by what we do. And that means that everybody who is, in any sense, part of the working class movement, in any sense, part of the left, needs to be actively working to create two things, actually, I think. I think we need mass organisations of the working class to provide a framework for the mass movements of resistance which we need. Most obviously on the question of austerity. We need to build a mass working class movement against austerity. We need to stop being lots of little campaigns. We need to stop being just local campaigns. We need local campaigns, we need lots of local campaigns, but we've got to weld them into a single mass movement. We've got to make them part of something massive and national and ultimately European and ultimately global, because that's the scale of the crisis, and we're just not measuring up to that at all. But we've also, within those mass movements that we have to build, we've got to create networks of revolutionaries. And I use that word quite deliberately, because every single one of us who's serious about affecting change has got to think in revolutionary terms, because there is no middle way. There are no limited solutions. There are no halfway solutions to any of these problems. The scale of the crisis that we confront is such that we have to build revolutionary organisations made up of people who understand that to solve the crisis of humanity in the 21st century, we're going to have to bring down finance capital and replace it with a different economic and social system based on the democratically organised expression of and interests of the great mass of ordinary people. There you go.
Thank you, Simon. Very powerful video, and I think considering when it was released, very prescient. I mean, it does often feel like his understanding and appreciation and seriousness for the scale of the catastrophe and the crisis of the last few years has really been borne out in a way that I think shows his perceptiveness. And yet, for all of that sense of that scale, retaining that sense of human agency as foremost important. Our next live speaker will be Joseph Healy. Joseph Healy was in Left Unity with Neil Faulkner and campaigned with him in Coalition of Resistance and the Zero COVID campaign. And he established ACR with Neil. He was one of the founder members with Neil. Joseph, would you like to unmute?
Yes, hello everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I first really got to know Neil when he was considering standing for the position of principal speaker in Left Unity. I had known him slightly from the Coalition of Resistance Committee, the predecessor of the People's Assembly. And it always struck me as someone quite open-minded, unlike some others who Neil would later refer to as the sects, and who he condemned as closed-minded and sectarian, and leading the left down a political and intellectual cul-de-sac. I didn't get involved in the Brick Lane debates where he played such a central role, but I did take part in several meetings about how to get a new revolutionary organization organized, mainly involving young people, where he wanted to utilize the forces which had been unleashed by the Brick Lane debates. It's true to say that I really got to know Neil well in the last 3 years of his life, but we were close until the end. I only gradually realized what a polymath he was as I'd encountered him in the world of politics, but became fascinated about the archaeological work he was doing in the Middle East, about Lawrence of Arabia's campaign there, and arranged to have a conversation with him about this, having read the 7 Pillars of Wisdom years ago and being interested in the campaign. I also spoke to him before Christmas about possibly visiting his Anglo-Saxon excavation in Norfolk, which I'd only recently found out about. This was a fascinating aspect of Neil for me, that unlike many involved in left politics, he had a huge hinterland and was active as a historian, archaeologist, and writer. He also moved seamlessly in many worlds. He told me about his tours of the Greek islands, with tourists wanting to know more about ancient Greek sites, and I often wondered if he conversed with them about Marxism while doing so. I'm sure, knowing Neil, that he would have slipped it in somewhere. Shortly before the 2019 election, which led to the demise of Corbynism, and in my opinion, any hope of the Labour Party being a radical force in British politics, an analysis which Neil shared, I attended one of the meetings about setting up the new radical Marxist organisation, which he felt was desperately needed and would be even more so after the election. At the end of the meeting, despite the reservations of some about the project, he asked me should we go ahead and plan a founding event as soon as possible after the election. I encouraged him to do so, and the rest is history. I worked with him on the steering committee of ACR for the first 2 years and witnessed his passion and frustration firsthand. He desperately wanted young people involved and radicalized, and was fearful with the collapse of Corbynism, an entire generation would either drift away from radical politics entirely or end up being sucked into the dead end of the sects with their worn out theories and top-down structures, which he felt would hugely alienate the young. Throughout the history of ACR, he wanted young people at the fore, and at one point wanted the entire steering committee to resign in order to have young people leading the organization. He did not believe that the left had any future without the young driving it and leading it with older comrades providing support. He made both history and politics interesting and alive, and had no time for dusty theories or old ways of working. If there was a barrier to radical action, Neil wanted it removed. His impatience was infectious, and although I didn't always agree, I respected his total sincerity and passion to activate the young and bring down the rotten system under which we are all suffering. I also worked with him on the Zero COVID Steering Committee, and his anger and disgust at the way in which the Tory government were condemning thousands to death and pursuing eugenicist policies was titanic. This, of course, became even more central to him once he became ill, and became one of the clinically extremely vulnerable who the Tories were and are prepared to throw to the wolves. It was typical of Neil that he took part in the demonstration about COVID and the government's murderous policies opposite Parliament, and then wound up that afternoon at the protest in Clapham Park about the murder of Sarah Everard and the resulting police violence against women gathered there to protest, and he wrote a powerful first-hand account of it later. When Neil became ill, we had a number of conversations about his illness. I'd had a diagnosis with a terminal illness in the 90s, but had managed to pull through, and we spoke often about his therapies and how he was faring. Despite being very tired from chemotherapy, etc., Neil continued to do more than the average healthy person would achieve in years. He remained positive and hopeful of a cure, and just before Christmas, he spoke about how much he was looking forward to spending time at home with his family for Christmas after having been discharged. It was a huge shock to me to discover in January that the treatment had failed, and I did not manage to speak to him after that, as he was already very ill. One of his emails last November on eco-socialism and the climate emergency sums up Neil's contempt for centrists and impatience about building a radical movement from the base up, and it sort of links in with the video we've just seen. He wrote, "Neoliberalism, the liberal centre, the Guardianistas, sections of the eco movement, etc., all put the emphasis on moralistic, guilt-ridden individual action. We cut through this like the Gordian knot by saying, alongside Monbiot, that all this stuff about ethical consumerism, etc., is so much liberal bourgeois bollocks. We counterpose red-green revolution and total social transformation. I think it is essential we keep saying this. We are not reformists. We do not think we can save humanity and the planet this side of the socialist revolution. We think we are facing a terminal crisis of the system. The very best of the young activists and many others are moving towards this understanding. These are the people we should be recruiting. We need to project hard revolutionary politics." Unquote. Neil's contribution to left politics in this country was groundbreaking on many levels, but I will also never forget the way in which he was always open to new ideas and to criticism, and how he mentored so many younger people along the way and remained always a beacon of hope and radical energy to so many of us. Neil's contribution in so many spheres will not be forgotten, and it is vital that his legacy leads to a new, vigorous and outward-looking left movement in this country. To paraphrase the Irish writer Tomás Ó Croghan, who wrote about the Blasket Islands, "Ní beag le hain ar ann na ríis." We will never see his like again.
Thank you, Joseph. That was really good. Thank you. And I think very apt. We have a penultimate clip. It's not the final clip. A penultimate clip from the BBC radio show In Our Time on Lawrence of Arabia, one of Neil's research subjects, and for which he had quite a passion. And I think this sort of demonstrates that. Simon, do you want to?
What does he see his function as?
Well, this, of course, is hugely controversial.
Great.
And yeah, I know. People argue argue endlessly about Lawrence's motivation and Lawrence's role. And I think we have to distinguish the two things, really. I think, it's not, you can caricature Lawrence as a kind of agent of British imperialism. And of course, the British are using him for their own purposes. But of course, he's not really on message. And he's not on message, I think, because he's not a regular officer. He's not a conventional member of the upper middle class. He's a romantic. He's got this Orientalist view of the Arabs. I think it's true to say that Lawrence is genuinely, at some level, rooting for the Arabs. I would describe him as a liberal imperialist who imagines that in the framework provided by the British Empire and the Arab Revolt, some kind of Arab state might emerge at the end of the First World War. I think he's in it for that. He wants to help create.
Faulkner, how did Lawrence react to the way this was resolved? He went to conferences in up to 1922, didn't he? What was he saying at those conferences, and how was his voice heard?
He's at two particularly important conferences. He's an advisor to Faisal at Versailles in 1919, and then again he's an advisor to Churchill when Churchill was colonial secretary in Cairo in 1921. And I think what Lawrence is doing is he's operating in post-war diplomacy in an attempt to get what he considers to be the best possible outcome for the Arabs. Now, I don't think that he had a clear conception of what that would look like. And just to pick up the point that Hussein has just made, I mean, I've already described him as a liberal imperialist, and I think his conception was that as he saw it, the more benevolent British Empire would provide the framework for the growing to nationhood of these new Arab states. And yet, of course, in reality, there was a wave of revolt from below where ordinary people were beginning to create their own future. And those attempts were, generally speaking, suppressed by the British Empire, with which Lawrence is closely associated in this post-war diplomacy. So it's quite a limited view, I think, that he has of what might happen.
There's a on, really. Just 2 or 3 years after the war, Lawrence began his global fame, down to an American reporter and cinematographer who made a report on him, showed it in Broadway, then in London, and we're told hundreds of thousands, millions of people saw it, and they wanted more of Lawrence, not of Allenby walking with his army in, and he grew from there. Can you take that on?
Yes. I mean, he wasn't a famous man at the end of the First World War. He becomes a famous man because of the Lowell Thomas show in 1919, which changes, actually. It evolves. I mean, initially, there wasn't that much emphasis on Lawrence because he...
Can you tell listeners what the Lowell Thomas show was? Because it's
well, it was a weird kind of thing, and we don't do this kind of thing anymore. But it was it was described as a travelogue. And I understand that it consisted of a series of what were then called lantern slides, old-fashioned slides, some moving images, a certain amount of music, some dancing, and a very racy commentary on the part of Lowell Thomas himself, the American journalist who becomes a kind of impresario. Now, what seems to happen as the show evolves is that the Lawrence element is ramped up because audiences respond with more enthusiasm to the Lawrence character than they do to the General Allenby and the traditional British military operations. And that turns Lawrence into what he himself describes as a matinee idol. He becomes an early example of 20th century celebrity culture.
And then he moves away into this strange 15 years of being in the ranks in the RAF, in the tank regiment, back in the RAF. And one of you described as a slow mental breakdown. Seven Pillars of Wisdom came out. Is some people think great book, you think great book, and very accurate reporting on what was happening there. Is there anything more anybody wants to say about those last years? Has he abandoned the Arab cause? Has that abandoned him? Where are we?
Well, what I would say is that he's abandoned the attempt to make a difference in 1921-22 because he's got as far as he thinks he can with the Cairo conference, and I think at the same time as he's involved in that post-war diplomatic effort, he's suffering a kind of mental breakdown, and I think you can read that in the pages of Seven Pillars of Wisdom, and I see him as a kind of permanent convalescent after that.
Is it breakdown because the British have betrayed the Arabs?
Yes, I think so. I mean, there are many different factors. We now talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, but that's a kind of portmanteau term anyway. It covers many different things. But I think specifically in his case, he was riddled with guilt about what he saw as the betrayal of the Arabs by British and French imperialism.
Hussein?
Thank you, Simon. Our next speaker is Jean Wolfe, who worked with Neil at the Left Book Club and the No Glory in War Memories, as well as on one of the digs in Jordan. Jean wrote the obituary for Neil, which is on The Guardian on Friday.
Thanks very much for having me on. Much has been covered, and I think Neil's legacy in life, in his life, is such that there can always be something else. And I think I'm going to sort of perhaps synthesize a few things, as well as say a little bit more about the something else, which is the archaeological digs. So this isn't for me to sum up, but to synthesize. And so that was something that he was very, very good at, was seeing the connections between things. Because everything he did and wrote connected to everything else. Otherwise, he wouldn't have done it. He was a dialectical thinker, and he knew and practiced things that led to change in understanding the world as well as action in the world. Now, I think it's probably my knowing Neil and my work with Neil is probably best told in the short 9-year chronology of getting to know and work with him. So Q 2013. No Glory in War was established, which is a coalition of anti-war groups set up to counteract the establishment's narrative of the causes, conduction and resolutions of World War I. And they called their thing 1418 Now. And although they lamented the suffering, as a good capitalist country would do, it saw it as a victory and an inevitable thing. Now, when Neil got involved, we knew we had our own big guns, and we could use a military analogy, sort of blast their arguments out of the water, which we did. And we launched No Glory in War. Here, I don't know if it comes out the right way. I suppose it does on Zoom. And it's expertly argued and clearly shows that this was a rich man's war in which 15 million poor men died. And we earlier saw that fantastic clip of Neil speaking in Parliament Square, where he was sort of waving the headline of the Evening Standard, which I think was, we'll remember them. But we didn't quite see in the clip the bottom of the Evening Standard, which was a couple of royals covered in poppies. So it was the occasion was the eve of the breakout of World War I. And we had our thing in Parliament Square in the open, soapboxes, passionate speeches. It was interesting, it was informative. And after Neil had finished speaking, Jeremy Corbyn read Keir Hardie's speech on the eve of World War I, opposing that war. And it's interesting to note that this was the same time as the establishment's gig over the road in Westminster Abbey. And it would have been boring. It would have been, I suppose, cassocks, poppies, liturgies, and a congregation that was taking that line. Now, the pamphlet was launched at Black's Club in Soho, which was a Writers Guild event, and where Neil also talked about the importance of the political pamphlet in progressive politics, that the pamphlet had always had a role from the Levellers up to now, and it always will in the future. It's a democratic thing, and it's material. You can, you know, it's important. So the brilliant synthesizer, he once said to me after a meeting at the Imperial War Museum, where we're doing some work there, quoting Freud's notion of the lonely psyche, and that the ancient Roman word fasces, which were bundles of sticks, single sticks tied together to make either weapons or things to build fences with, where each stick lost its individuality, and that this is where the word fascism comes from. Now, Neil was full of that sort of interesting textured detail, which was not esoteric knowledge. It had a deep truth and interest to it. So from Freud's lonely psyche to fasces, that's interesting stuff. Before the No Glory work got going, I went to hear him speak at a rally, This Changes Everything, and I was very impressed by eloquence that wasn't loquacious, passion that wasn't messianic, and above all, clarity and an account, very simply put, but with the right amount of sophistication. You know, he knew he was speaking to a sophisticated audience of why neoliberalism is bad for you and why socialism is good for you, in the way that Marx outlined it. So making class analysis and subsequent revolution seem like a no-brainer, you needed somebody with brains to do that. It seems like a contradiction, but he really was great like that. And he also wrote as he spoke. And although he's academically as sound as a bell, the writing was always fresh and lively. And as a materialist, the politics of materialism, he also gloried in the imagination. So there was this whole side to Neil the writer, Neil the poet. But anyway, during the No Glory work, we realized we had a shared interest in the work of T. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia. And I accompanied him on one of the digs. I think there were about 8 or 9, a series of digs called GARP, which is the Great Arab Revolt Project. And the precocious, mischievous figure, the sort of seemingly anti-establishment figure of T. Lawrence, was very fascinating, not just as a military commander and writer, but as somebody that suffered badly after the Sykes-Picot betrayal after World War I, and what happened to Lawrence then. I was writing a play, The Man with the Gold, because Lawrence famously, well, maybe not a lot of people know this, but Lawrence carried huge amounts of gold in his saddlebags given to him by the British to buy off the Bedou, hence The Man with the Gold. And Neil was writing a book. I think it's already been flashed up, but Neil's Lawrence of Arabia's War is a brilliant read, very, very good. And it was launched at King's College. And that book launch was just a riveting account of the Arab Revolt and the legacy of T. Lawrence. But I learned also the importance of terrain and the very earth in military action. And Neil always called his archaeological work, whether it was in Norfolk, and I can't speak with any authority on that, although according to the Guardian obituary, I can. They put all this research in there in my name, so they can have it. But the grounding truth that was going on in Jordan, again, to bring in Freud, it was linking psychoanalysis with archaeology, and that both involved a delayering the truth of landscape and the actions that could or could not be taken in it, and a delayering of the psyche. And for both of us, the delayering of Lawrence's psyche was very interesting, that the various personae he had, you know, the World War I officer with a sort of cap and khaki, and then the Bedouin robes, the RAF infantry uniform, and then finally, if you get down to someone's skin, there's always signs of a beating on Lawrence because of the agonizing over the guilt of Sykes-Picot. He had himself whipped every few years or something, which is actually shown in the film. But the political implications of that is that if you invade a body by through physical abuse, something similar happens to that person that happens to if you invade a country through physical abuse. And Neil was very good, again, the synthesizing and seeing the links between those. And this is what I think both of us have been writing about, whether it's in drama or in the book. It's all quite heavy stuff. So I'm sort of trying to think of a light anecdote from the dig. And the only one I can dig up is this one, is that on our day off as amateur archaeologists, it's all a bit mad dogs and Englishmen, you know, but we had a day off. We weren't digging under the hot sun. It was October, say warm sun. We went to see Petra, the rose red city, which was the remains of the Nabatean civilization. It's a fantastic place. But Neil was having trouble getting us all in because I don't think his Arabic was that good. And why haven't you bought your tickets? And how many of you are there? And how long you stay? All the rest of it. And I reminded him that he had a letter from the king in his pocket, granting the whole dig free entry. And given that he had so little regard for kings and what they could grant, he'd sort of forgotten about it, and it was all sort of torn up with the bus tickets and invoices and stuff. So it was pieced together, and the whole dig got in, and it was fascinating. Finally, the Left Book Club, which was Neil's idea. In fact, he had the idea at Blacks after the launching of the No Glory campaign, which shows that once the mind gets going, you one thing leads to another. You have other ideas. And I think you can see behind me, the pile of orange books are the books that we produced as sort of an amateur volunteer committee before we got too many members and Pluto had to take over, although Pluto was integrally involved in those. So the black and yellow ones are the books that are coming out through Pluto now. And we have, I think there are 2 people tuned in. There's Anna Minton's book there, Simon Hanna's book there, and 2 of Neil's, People's History of the Russian Revolution and A Radical History of the World. And those meetings were like seminars. They were so interesting, you know, as well as the dynamics, which was interesting. There was a product at the end of it, like a book and a decision. And I thought, how unlike the rather mealy-mouthed, dull management meetings of today, where you're looking at targets and charts and number crunching, and you know, they were what politics is all about. And this is part of Neil's legacy. And this time next year, that second column will be half as high again. Yes, and then out of this came the Brick Lane debates, and Neil believed, very used word these days, but passionately, or with complete integrity, of the importance of face-to-face debate and how that changes people. And he was very, very, to bring on young people, to encourage them and to empower them through ideas and practice of public speaking was a key part of what he was about. So it's an incredible legacy, and the play Blood, Gold and Oil, it's Changed from the Man with the Gold to Blood, Gold and Oil, will be out next year for the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, and it will be dedicated to Neil Faulkner. And I'm sure everybody here misses him. I miss him. My condolences to Lucy, Rowena, Tiggy, Finian, and everybody that worked with him, and again misses him. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about him.
Thank you, Jan. And I always remember how he used the phrase "the truth is the whole" from Hegel in Creeping Fascism, and made that philosophy seem so relevant and not at all abstract, as I think a Marxist use of Hegel should. And it always stuck to me from the book, and it's also been evident in all of the contributions about how he could link the different facets of the crisis and the different facets of the struggle together, and that was always a perspective he maintained. I'm going to pass over to Simon Hanna, who worked with Neil in Left Unity, the Brick Lane debates, and co-authored with Neil System Crash. And then I'm going to move directly on to Fred Laplade, who I'll introduce now just to sort of get things keep things sort of moving. Fred Laplace worked with Neil in the Coalition of Resistance, Zero COVID, Left Unity and ACR, and published through Resistance books 3 of Neil's work, System Crash, Alienation and Spectacle of Revolution, and he's going to be taking contributions from the floor as the chair after Simon Hanna has given his live speech. So I'll pass over to Simon Hanna.
Thank you very much, Rowan, and thank you also to everyone that's commented so far, and obviously some of the lovely comments in the chat as well. I won't talk for too long. I just wanted to just make some kind of brief remarks. I first met Neil when he came to discuss with me a possible book project. This is back in 2016 now. And we met in a cafe near Euston, and we kind of knocked around ideas, and that became the basis of me writing a party with socialists in it. And Neil was always very supportive of people's writing projects or their campaign initiatives or whatever they were trying to do. He was such a very kind of positive energy. And I think it's unfortunately too common sometimes for people on the left to have been around for quite a long time to get kind of quite rigid in their thinking, or even to sometimes act almost suspicious around new people. But Neil wasn't like that at all. Neil was someone who was incredibly approachable, intellectually curious, and I found always interested in what you had to say. And I want to just briefly make some remarks to focus on those qualities. I think people have spoken very powerfully about, some of his contributions around politics, but I've been active on the left for over 20 years now, and it is just remarkably positive to meet someone who is so engaging and so welcoming and so much wants to deal with you and talk to you and work with you as an equal around political projects. And I think given the the tiny size of the revolutionary left at the moment, unfortunately internationally, certainly tiny compared to the scale of the tasks before us, and also the tendency for some people on the left to have quite explosive and damaging arguments about all manner of politics, to meet a comrade like Neil, who was so approachable, open and generous of spirit, I just think that's very important. He always welcomed new comrades, and I found, he was obviously, kind of critical of things he didn't agree with, and, he would challenge, things that he thought were wrong. But he did want people to contribute, and he did want people to be part of a collective. And I think that was a real strength. It's no surprise to me really that, he often talked with me about Brick Lane debates. And I think in many ways, Brick Lane debates was the political project, that he was most proud of, because, it was Neil working with, a group of very young people who had come into politics for the first time. And I think he just really admired their energy and their, and their ideas and, sort of their, the way they were thinking about things and, and challenging things. And, Neil was often saying to me sort of we need to try and recreate Brick Lane debates. And I always said, well, that would be amazing to do so. But also sometimes you do just catch lightning in a jar and you manage to make, something happen out of the particular situation at the time. But I think also around his intellectual curiosity, that was something that I really liked, like we've heard, from all the previous speakers, the range of interests, what he wrote about, covering ancient societies, antiquity, up to 20th century warfare, and more recent publications on, the growing threat of authoritarianism and fascism globally. It really revealed a thinker who was versatile, but also someone who used his Marxism as a tool, was like a set of tools to understand the world, whether you're talking about societies over 2,000 years ago or things that are happening in, the United States or, Britain today. And two of his recent long form essays, two of the last things that he wrote before he passed away, on alienation, spectacle and revolution. And the last one that he did, which he called Mindfuck. These are pamphlets which also, I think, showed a new direction for Neil, not just focusing on history and politics, but also looking at, kind of cultural arguments as well as psychological arguments. Mindfuck in particular saw Neil, branching out into new areas, I think, and, kind of looking at Dr. Freud as, as well as Dr. Marx, to try and illuminate the what was going on around the re-emergence of mass irrational ideas and reactionary politics and fascistic movements. And I think that was, that was really interesting. And obviously that's one of the tragedies that, that sort of vein of thinking that he was exploring has been cut short. Neil was motivated by the big ideas, the grand themes and struggle of our age. He was someone who saw the urgency of the situation. Certainly what compelled him and myself to work together was the concern over the climate catastrophe, was the concern over the creeping, sometimes galloping rise of far-right politics around the world, but also the belief that things could be better and that we could begin to marshal forces to improve the situation, and that it's not no Marxist can go down to despair and giving up. You have to do what you can with what you've got and make the arguments that you can to try and rally the forces that can make a progressive radical change. And believing in the actuality of the revolution, believing that the working class and popular forces can come to the lead of movements around democracy and for social justice, and go beyond that, begin to challenge capitalism and imperialism itself. That was obviously at the core of Neil's thinking and what he wanted to achieve and what he fought for all of his life. So I'll just conclude by saying, I think as with all these tragic instances, the thing that haunts you the most is the feeling that you didn't get to spend enough time talking to Neil, that he had so much to say and to contribute. He was always interested in bouncing his ideas off you and hearing your thoughts on things as well. And I think it's that collaboration which I will miss the most. That feeling of finding another Marxist who wants to engage with you as an equal and values your contribution, and you find huge value in their contribution as well. So Neil is gone, but we are still here, and his fight is our fight. And we know that Neil wants us to continue the struggle that he dedicated his life to, fighting fascist reaction, ending barbaric capitalism, and liberating humanity from the shackles of our prehistory. And that is the struggle that we must continue with today and into the future, no matter the odds.
Yeah, thank you very much, Simon. Yeah, very moving. And just occurred to me that today is the 4th of April. Neil died on the 4th of February, just exactly 2 months ago. Such a short time, but so much has happened in these 2 months. And seeing these videos and hearing his voice is really moving in terms of thinking how much we miss Neil. Neil, like many of us, was somebody we would phone up often to sort of work out what we needed to do about this, that, and the other, the latest political position that we needed to work on, and to hear his enthusiasm and his optimism about what was necessary. And that was infectious, and it was very important. He was certainly full of beans, full of ideas, full of energy. He was somebody who was quick-witted, very sharp, and he had a huge reservoir of culture and knowledge. And Simon was talking about Mindfuck, his latest book here, which you can't quite see there, but which is he describes as drawing on Marxist Freudian theory to provide an updated analysis of the psychology of fascism. And he told me once that actually he's probably the only revolutionary, or one of the few revolutionaries, who'd read the whole of Marx and the whole of Freud. So there you are. It's somebody, there are very few people like that who we can rely on to share their knowledge and share their experience in a way that so many comrades have told us. And what I think brought me and comrades who, from the tradition I come from, Socialist Resistance and the Fourth International, together with Neil and others, is his rejection of dogmatism and sectarianism, i.e. the idea that you've got the truth and yet you're a red professor, and that we don't need to learn new things. And I first met him in 2010 when we launched the Coalition of Resistance with Comrades and Counterfire and others. And one of the things he did buy from Socialist Resistance, or Resistance books, because that's what I'm here from, is a book on new parties of the left in Europe. At the time, in 2011, there was optimism that broad radical parties were providing the opportunity for
not necessarily a revolutionary vision, but certainly a change of society. And we've seen that, you know, the legacy of that eventually was also through the rise of Corbynism and Corbyn himself. And that rejection of dogmatism and sectarianism, I think, was what helped bring a number of us from different political traditions on the revolutionary left to say that, you know, the crisis is so deep, we are few, but we do have a lot in common, and we should bring ourselves together in creating a new political organisation, anti-capitalist resistance. And I think that's his political legacy. And his political legacy, apart from his legacy in terms of history, archaeology, and so on and so forth. And you know, it's worked because it's the test of events that, you know, shows how people coming from different political traditions can work together and survive events which, in some other political currents, they may fragment, may explode, and so on. And if we think about what's happened in the last 2 months, which is why maybe, you know, Neil is not so close in front of our eyes, is, you know, the war in Ukraine is as I can't remember who was saying at the beginning, you know, imperialism is violence and theft. And it doesn't matter which imperial it is, you know, we're seeing, you know, the destructive violence of one particular imperialism today in Ukraine, but, you know, our own imperialism, you know, is fueling the war in Yemen and elsewhere. And it's callousness in Britain in particular by being so mean-spirited about refugees from Ukraine, let alone the Windrush generation and so on. So anyway, and just one last thing to say that, you know, it's a shame that we have to do this on Zoom, because there's nothing like meeting each other, to reminisce in corners and to hug each other. And I'm sure we will do that physically. And I had spoken to Nick at Houseman's to do an evening there, to do something we could meet up together, and I'll be hassling him tomorrow morning so that we can do that. So anyway, I'm going to open up the floor now for people to make contributions, and I hope that, you know, you can make short contributions. Remember, Neil, say what you like, and your reminiscences, and just stick your hand up in the reaction so I can see you. But if oh yeah, Dan's the first one. Yeah, go on, Dan.
Thanks, Fred. Yeah, just wanted to start by obviously passing my condolences to Neil's family. But from a personal point of view, like with Neil, what I really liked about him was that although he was blessed with huge charisma, a lot of people I've met on the left with that amount of charisma are often like quite egotistical, and that can be an issue. And that was never the case with Neil. Like, Neil always seemed to want to kind of use his knowledge and use his charisma to inspire other people. And from a personal point of view, you know, like, I felt like, you know, he re-engaged me in some ways in politics, and, you know, gave me, you know, I felt like he gave you an energy to get involved, because he would outline the huge daunting tasks, you know, of socialists that we've got in terms of, you know, when he talked about creeping authoritarianism and creeping fascism. But at the same time, he wouldn't be pessimistic about it. You know, there would be a huge amount of optimism that even if the left is like, oh, sorry, phone's going on. Even if, you know, we've got, we're relatively small in terms of our forces at the moment, you know, he showed, you know, through historical events, how often that could change very quickly, and how much that, you know, that's needed in terms of like what we're facing in the world today. So yeah, I just want to say, you know, thank you for how he was with me, and thank you for the huge political contributions he made. And I will really miss being able to talk to him about politics, but I'll also miss him just as a person as well, and I'll miss his warmth, and as people said, like the kindness that he had when he spoke to you, and the kind of ability that he had to transfer like quite complicated ideas, and would never get impatient with you if you didn't understand. So yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for all the contributions that everyone's made that have been really wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. The next person is Hank Roberts.
Yeah, very, very quickly. A brilliant tribute to a. Am I unmuted now?
No, you're fine. You're fine. Go ahead.
A brilliant tribute to a brilliant person. I knew him through the early days of the Left Book Club, along there with Jan Wolfe and David Castle and Anna Minton. Jan and Dave gave great contributions by the way, and had some political differences, but not in the terms of his worth. He was absolutely an extremely special and talented and brilliant person. So thank you very much to all the people that have arranged this. Thank you.
Thanks, Hank. Owen?
Hi, thank you so much. I don't think any of you know me apart from Simon. I'm Owen, I'm a history postgrad student. I didn't know Neil, and I haven't been involved with any of the organising that he has done. But I just wanted to come along because of the influence that Neil had on me as a historian. Because sort of as a young teenager, it was really encountering Neil's books, especially the Marxist History of the World, on the Russian Revolution, and also later his books on ancient Rome, that really kind of opened up for me, hit like the sort of, I guess, like the vistas of history as like a discipline. And I had some basic familiarity with most Marxist history beforehand, but reading his book, and it, you know, goes from like ancient Sumeria through, you know, an attempted sort of panoramic of all world history, and elaborating all these concepts of mode of production, class struggle as a motor of history, and all this sort of thing. It really sort of inspired me to want to do history and to go into history. I met him once when he came to Liverpool on the centenary of the October Revolution to come and do a talk about Petrograd in 1917, which was really sort of an amazing thing to attend on that anniversary. And I met him once then, and he was very encouraging to me to go on to pursue like history in an academic setting. And I've always, in whatever I've been writing on Rome or on basically any other period of history, I've always returned to sort of Neil's writings and the fantastic sort of recommended bibliography that he has in the back of all of his books, of sort of where to go with this. So yeah, I just thought he was a really wonderful historian, and all his contributions on the First World War, and also his debate on the Roman Empire at the Oxford Union, and other sort of YouTube videos of him that there are, I just think are really amazing resources. And it's a terrible tragedy that he's passed away. But I just thought I'd want to come on and say what a big influence he's been.
Yeah, thanks, Owen. Thanks a lot. That's very interesting, very moving to hear that, you know, he reached, you know, so far away, and other people that we didn't come across, or I didn't come across in our activity as a political activist in campaigns. Jamie, I think, is the next person. Yeah, Jamie.
Hi there. Happy Sunday, everyone, and solidarity. But just going to share a quick story of how I met Neil. He's going to be greatly missed. But my full jump into politics was in the post-2019 wake of the general election. And it was all with the question of, in the next 4 years, will I be happy? Will I be happy if I just stand by and don't do anything to at least try and do something to change the outcome of what could happen until the next general election, straight after the election happened? And it was like, no. And then so I was reading Clement Attlee's book at the time, and I worked up in Camden, and I read that Clement Attlee got involved with the Fabians. So I thought, oh, I'll go maybe look at the young Fabians. And I had a Christmas party. And on the day of the Christmas party in late December after the election, I was in Houseman's bookshop browsing before it's this Christmas thing at the Fabians. And I was at Houseman's browsing, and there's these three interesting gentlemen in the bookshop. Happened to be Simon, Rowan, and Neil, all there about to have a mutiny meeting. And I didn't know that, but I got chatting to them. I said, recommend any books, and Simon recommended me his book, Labour, Party of the Socialists, and then I got speaking to Neil, and they said, "Oh, what are you up to?" Da, da, da. They got this meeting. There was a mutiny meeting, I think one of the founding ones. I got talking to them then before this baby meeting in the evening, and from there, Simon and Ron continued to have these meetings. I continued to attend, and it was all great. And in February 2020, we did a event called "Do We Need a Revolution to Save the Planet?" And I worked with Neil on that, and he empowered me to show me how to organize political events. And then COVID happened. And I did disconnect with a lot of it due to the complications of being social and physical with things in COVID. But I spent a lot of time pondering what I'd learned from Neil and also Simon and Rowan, and from everything he had given me. And many things I've come to. And he got in touch with me in December, just before the New Year's. And I can't miss him enough. And I wish you all a great year ahead. May we make it the best one yet so far. Solidarity to all, and love you all lot. Thank you for my time.
Thanks a lot, Jamie. That's great. I mean, the mutiny meetings were a great little place where to knock around ideas and to be inspired. Yes. Anybody else wants to come in or share some thoughts? Gary Rossin. Gary. You've got to unmute yourself, Gary.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me along to this, which has been incredibly moving. I have been sort of co-director with Neil with his archaeological project in Norfolk, and involved in various other projects as well. And I'd just like to say, that for many of you, there is another parallel world, that's been taking place. I think we could have gone on for hours, talking with these stories in terms of Neil's political life. But there's been so many things said this afternoon that resonates with me with Neil's archaeological project, which is sort of like started in 1996. The stories that people have been telling of how Neil has developed them, how he's supported them, and how he's given them opportunities is just sort of amplified really in what he's done over the years for people in the archaeological, the heritage sector, and the historical sector. There's sort of like many stories which we're hoping this summer during our excavation season, been working with Lucy and the family to put an event like this together, which will be held in Norfolk. We're looking to put a date together, but it'll be something like this, where we will be essentially bringing people together from sort of like Neil's archaeological world. But I just wanted to say that, when we put this, get the dates finalized, you're all welcome to come along. And if you, want to venture up and see this world that sort of is created every summer in this little field in Norfolk. But, the stories that have been told today, there are many similar ones, that Neil has sort of created over the years. So, and, I'd love to, if we manage to get this physical get together sometime, wherever that will be, I'd love to attend that. But thanks again for everybody involved in putting all this together.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Gary. I think I'd be very interested in popping up to Norfolk to see that, because I did hear about it, and it would be an interesting experience. I think it was a different type of dig. It was a popular people's-led dig as opposed to an academic dig.
Very much so. I mean, the archaeology is fascinating, but I think that there'd be a lot there that you would see and experience that would resonate with many of the stories that have been told here, today.
I've got to take Terry, and just one thing before I take Terry is that some of us, Rowan in particular, and Simon and Phil are getting together a collection of Neil's political writings over the last couple of decades, something like that, right? So, so watch this space. We are going to be producing it through Resistance Books, or however we're going to produce it. We'll approach others as well. And obviously, these things do cost money in terms of producing books. So, if anybody wants to help with that project, look out for announcements about the fund drive to help finance the design, etc., etc. So I'll take Terry.
Thanks, Fred, and thanks to everybody. It's been an incredibly powerful meeting thus far, and I wasn't going to say anything because I didn't have the privilege of knowing Neil nearly as well as many of the other comrades here. But I wanted to pick up on something that struck me when Gary was talking, that struck me when other people have been talking, because one of the things I experienced from Neil was that he made everybody in a conversation feel like they had something to offer, and that their ideas and their energies were important to him. Phil talked about Neil being our greatest orator, and I think that's true, but he wasn't an orator from on high. He was an orator that spoke to every individual and drew them out, and I think that's an even greater talent than being somebody who can speak to lots of people, being somebody who can also speak to every individual and make them feel special. And that's incredibly motivating. And just on Fred's point, as somebody who went on my first and last dig when I was 17, I hope we can think of politics in the broadest possible sense as Neil did, and not eliminate from what we're putting together his historical and archaeological writings, because I think they were profoundly political in as much as those things where he was talking more explicitly about revolutionary politics. And I think the contribution we just had from Owen really underlined the power of those writings. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Terry. Does anybody else want to share thoughts? We've been here for nearly 2 hours now. Jamie, you've put your hand up again. Is that what you?
Hi, yeah, actually, can I just give a very quick, short poem I wanted to quickly say, but is that all right? Like 30 seconds.
Go on.
It's a poem and it's titled Democracy by David Lee Morgan. Back in the Middle Ages, they had this thing called the church, and it was their gig to tell you God will and what to do about it. Then Martin Luther hit the nail on the head and said, "You decide." But that was too simple and way too dangerous. So they hacked off, made a few changes, and come up with this thing called democracy. Who decides? Democracy, where God is a man with the TV stations. God is a man with a gun to take him. God is a man with the money to buy the guns, to take the stations to convince the nation that he is a suppository of divine relation. Who decides? Well, we all took a vote and I voted against it. But who decides? Well, I don't like it, but there's nothing I can do about it. Who put the lines on the maps that make the corpses fall on one side while the other side plays democracy? Who drew the lines around Palestine? Who dug a ditch around an oil field and called it Kuwait? They say there are no pacifists and gasoline lines, but when the majority votes for national salvation, when the majority votes for mass incineration, when the majority votes for racial purification, fuck him. Yeah, Democracy by David Lee Morgan. The River Was a God. But it's a great little piece.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's great. Yes.
Quite intense.
Okay. Look, I don't see any other hands up. You know, we don't have a limit, but we have been here 2 hours, and this is not the end of our remembering Neil in all sorts of his contributions. There's a dig in Norfolk. There'll definitely be a physical event that I'll be approaching Houseman's again to see if we can have their space for an evening. There's other things, and but you know, do buy his books. Mindfuck being the last one. And actually, I should say one thing I do regret about this book is that, you know, I got it in my hands from the printers about a couple of days after he died, and I would have liked so much that he could have had a copy of it and seen it. You know, I did have a discussion with him about whether the word "fuck" was appropriate in the title, and I'm glad to see that I gave in to him. It certainly will grab people's attention when it's on the tables in bookshops. So again, thank you particularly for all the speakers. Thanks a lot for Simon Pearson for having done the technical stuff. I mean, maybe Simon, you want to share, you know, your memories as a last contribution here now. I mean, I don't know if you want to pop in and say. I mean, you did a great job in terms of getting it all together. Simon, do you want to say a few things?
I guess just echoing what everyone else has said today. Neil kind of got me enthused in politics again after being absent from it for many years. The thing that always amazed me with Neil was his ability to sound like he was telling you something for the first time when he probably explained a Marxist concept to someone just like me probably 1,000 times over, and we'll definitely miss him in the ACR. As Phil said, he was an intellectual force, a revolutionary force, and I just hope that the ACR will continue to grow, and that will be a fitting legacy for Neil, and also that we're able to work with other comrades from other organisations more often than not. Neil believed passionately that the revolutionary left was too small, split up into little sects, and if we can do one thing, and that is come together on the things that we do agree about rather than spend an awful lot of time fighting over the things that we disagree over, I think that would be a fitting legacy. We've got a clip to play out of Neil speaking at the last ACR conference. It's about sort of 15 minutes long, so please don't feel that you have to stay through to the end. We will be putting the clip up on our website later on, so well, the whole event as well, and I'll edit out my little text snafu at the beginning, so apologies. I hope I didn't spoil it too much for people. Thank you.
It was great. There's lots of compliments in the chat there, so thanks a lot again for the technical side to Simon. Your last comments there is really great as well in terms of how Neil, you know, brought all of us together and inspired many others. So okay, so yes, thanks everybody for staying again. We'll just, as a play out, as Simon said, we'll just have Neil's final video there, you know, and see you in the struggle, comrades. See you in the barricades. See you fighting together for, you know, a better world and peace in this world. Peace and socialism in this world.
Comrades, right at the very beginning is say that the period that we are living through compares with nothing that we have experienced really since the 1930s. We are living in an epoch of catastrophe, an age of catastrophe, and an age as well of revolution and
counter-revolution. I don't think it's an exaggeration to use those terms, that kind of language, and I'm going to try and explain why. Let me just stress that these are going to be very broad brush generalizations. I've got 15 minutes to introduce, and I'm going to leave it to comrades in the discussion to come in with the nuances. Some of those nuances are reflected in the amended version of the document which you've got. There were amendments from various members of the SC that all got incorporated, and then the amendments that have been sent in since the SC is in agreement with, as Simon has already indicated, and a lot of the nuances are reflected in that. I'm going to deal with some broad brush generalizations. I'm going to start by saying that this is a compound crisis of world capitalism, and in the international document we identify the different aspects of that compound crisis. We talk, of course, about the ecological crisis in terms of climate, and COP26 has just confirmed for all of us the inability of the international ruling class to take the measures that are necessary in order to address the climate crisis. I mean, I don't need to say anything to anybody on this call about the gravity of that crisis and the way in which it is accelerating and the huge impacts that it's going to have on world society and the period immediately ahead. And then there's another aspect of the ecological crisis now, which is, of course, the epidemiological crisis. That too has just ratcheted up with the emergence of Omicron. Omicron won't be the last variant. There will be others because the situation is that COVID is now embedded in world society, and there will be other viruses as well. So we're living in a world not just of climate catastrophe capitalism, but virus catastrophe capitalism as well, with huge implications really for the economy and society. These these two types of ecological crisis are then situated within a long-term crisis of overaccumulation in world capitalism, which has given rise to a whole series of what are effectively pathological economic trends in the 40 years or so of the neoliberal era, pathological characteristics that the system has that have been ramped up hugely since 2008. And there's no question 2008 is a major turning point. And we talk in the document about some of those economic pathologies, the dominance of finance capital, financialization, the creation of fictitious capital, profiting without producing, the wave of privatization, which is effectively a sell-off of public assets and public services in the interests of private capital, the manic consumerism, at least in the global north, in the more developed parts of the world economy, and so on and so forth. A whole series of responses to the crisis of overaccumulation, to the fact that the whole fundamental problem is that basic investment in production, in raising the productivity of labor, in creating useful things, has slowed down massively, that we're in a kind of long-term period of stagnation slump, which really underpins the neoliberal era. And then the social crisis, and we identify that as another component of the compound crisis, and that flows directly out of the way in which forms of what I shall call state capitalism have broken down, corporate power has been ramped up, the programs of outsourcing and privatization have led to huge increases in corporate power and the accumulation of wealth on a global scale in the hands of private capital, and therefore in the hands of the super rich who control private capital, so that we have got unprecedented levels now of social inequality across the world system, and social inequality which is increasing all the time. And then we have a geopolitical crisis, which is quite apparent from, you know, any news bulletin that's looking at international affairs, is dominated by images of this unfolding geopolitical crisis, a swathe of mayhem in particular, stretching from Central Asia across the Middle East into Africa. That's really the kind of epicenter, really, of the breakdown of the geopolitical order. Increases in arms expenditure globally, a growing possibility of a major war involving major powers. And, you know, the obvious example of that right now is the way in which tension is ratcheting up in the Pacific. And at the back of that, of course, always the possibility that there could be a nuclear exchange between the superpowers if there was an accidental tipping, and it would probably be an accidental thing. I don't think any of the great powers would actively seek a war, but they might be driven into a war by the logic of unfolding events, and that could turn into a nuclear exchange. And then the final element that we identify in this crisis is the political ideological change, which is best defined as a shift on a global scale on the right to the right. And I want to stress that there is polarization. There is a shift to the left on our side. You only have to look at the way in which the mood music has changed in the climate movement to realize that on our side, people are shifting to the left. People are coming to more radical conclusions. But what is dominant across the system is a shift to the right, to the authoritarian right, which, you know, we understand this in terms of the concept of creeping fascism and the global police state. And that leads me into the second part of the introduction, which is to develop this idea that we are in an age of revolution and counter-revolution, which initially seems counterintuitive. And yet, in a sense, it is true, even though events are playing out more slowly than they did in the 1930s and have less definition than they did in the 1930s. And I think that that is bound up with the fact that if we think about the two major social classes, neither of the two major social classes, the international bourgeoisie, the international capitalist class on the one hand, the international working class on the other. And when I talk about the working class, I'm including all of the oppressed, all of the poor. I'm thinking about 85, 90% of the world's population. Neither of the two great classes forming modern global society are at the moment in a position to offer any real solutions to the crisis. And that's different from the 1930s, let me say. I mean, there was a shift among the ruling class in the 1930s to forms of state capitalism, which is, you know, represented by what's happening in Russia. It's represented by what's happening in Nazi Germany. It's represented by Roosevelt's New Deal in the United States. The bourgeoisie was actually putting forward ways of dealing with the depression in the 1930s. We're not really seeing that kind of bourgeois solution or capitalist solution being put forwards at the moment. But what's also true, if you look at the 1930s, is that revolution, socialist revolution, was on the agenda. I mean, it's represented in a very obvious way by the struggle in Spain, the Spanish Revolution in 36, 37, and then the Spanish Civil War. The working class was mobilized, and the working class was putting forward its own solution to the crisis. Went down to defeat, of course, but the working class was an active player. Whereas what is happening now is there don't seem to be any solutions, and or the forces to deliver on solutions don't seem to be there. Now, in terms of the ruling class, I think that means a squeezing of the liberal centre. I don't want to exaggerate it. I've been told by comrades, and I agree with the criticisms that comrades on the SC made of this, the initial version of the document. I don't want to exaggerate the squeezing of the liberal centre, but there is a squeezing of the liberal centre because of the liberal centre's incapacity to offer solutions, and that is producing a shift to the authoritarian right. And the authoritarian right represents a form of creeping fascism. Within the umbrella of the authoritarian right, harder forms of fascism are growing, and that is connected with the increasing militarization and repressiveness of the bourgeois state, and the degree to which the bourgeois state is becoming an instrument for racism, the suppression of dissent, the construction of borders, the militarization of borders, and so on. You've only got to look at Patel's bill, for example, which would effectively illegalize any protest that the police didn't like the look of in Britain, or what is happening in the United States at the moment, where Republican-controlled states are organizing for voter suppression, for the gerrymandering of votes, preparing for 2024 and the rising possibility of a more effective coup attempt in the event that the Republican candidate, who will probably be Trump, doesn't actually win the election. And you can also look at what is happening in relation to abortion rights as an example, really, as a very, very clear indication of that shift to the right that is going on the right, and in terms of how the bourgeois state is operating. But finally, we have this problem on our side. There is growing immiseration of the working class, the oppressed and the poor on a global scale. It's not an exaggeration to say that in terms of the absolute numbers, the level of social misery that we are looking at today has never been seen before in human history. I mean, we're talking about billions of people who are living in the slum cities of the global south, for example, in conditions of absolutely appalling and increasing poverty and marginalization. That immiseration of the working class and the increasing repressiveness of the state, the suppression of democracy, the suppression of minority groups, the scapegoating of minorities, and so on. What that's doing is it's producing a series of explosions, and it's impossible to exaggerate the explosiveness from below that we have witnessed in the last 20 years, since really the beginning of the start of the anti-capitalist movement. A series of enormous popular explosions, somewhat suppressed of late by the pandemic, but up until the outbreak of the pandemic, it was, you know, there was a whole series of them across the world, and we've seen some despite the pandemic since. This is a huge eruption from below in response to the growing social distress and the growing political repression and the threat represented by the capitalist class and the right and the bourgeois state and growing fascist forces and so on. But what tends to happen with these explosions is they go up like a rocket and then come down like a stick. And we need to understand why that is. And there's been a real shift in the in the neoliberal era, really, in the 40 years of the neoliberal era, where working class community has degraded, where people have become more atomized, forming less stable communities, having less stable forms of employment, where building trade union organization has become much more difficult because of these shifts. And that, in addition to the way in which the ruling class for the last 40 years has been on the offensive, of course, against trade union organization, and that has knocked back labor organization. And that means, in a sense, that at the base, on our side, there is very little in the way of strong foundation, very little in the way of ballast, sustaining, supporting class-based resistance and making it durable, making it possible to sustain struggle over a period. I think it's difficult to exaggerate the significance of the global decline of trade union organization, which was basically the foundation for the whole business of struggle for well over 100 years, from the late 19th to the late 20th century, how fundamental the shift is, where we don't really have that strong foundation anymore. And we have these unstable, explosive, spontaneous, erratic, episodic struggles, which then go down. And as they go down, as they recede, the ruling class is still in place, capital is still in place, the siphoning of wealth to the top is still continuing, the bourgeois state is still there, and so on. Now, that's a fundamental problem for our side. And it's connected with this last point, which is the weakness of revolutionary organization, revolutionary leadership, revolutionary forces that we would expect to see embedded in those movements and arguing for pushing the movements outwards, making connections with other struggles, and building the kind of organization out of those movements that might make the mass struggle more durable, ultimately arguing, of course, as revolutionaries, that we need to think in terms of building organs of mass democracy from below. Sections of the working class, sections of the oppressed being organized democratically, and taking control of parts of the urban space. I mean, that's the level at which we have got to be thinking of it. You just think about what happens in Spain in 1936, in the revolution in Spain in 1936, half the country is taken control of by a workers and peasants movement. The ruling class effectively disintegrates across half of Spain, and you then get a mass movement from below of workers and peasants control of the workplaces and the land. Now, that's the kind of scale.
You wrap up, Neil.
Yeah, will do. That's the kind of scale on which things need to be happening. The lack of, the weakness of revolutionary organization embedded in the mass movements, arguing for those things, is a fundamental problem. It's very similar, here's my last comment, very similar in a way to 1938, when Trotsky talked about the crisis of world civilization being essentially the crisis of revolutionary organization. There you go.
Well, thanks a lot, Neil. Thanks a lot for your life. Thanks a lot for all your inspiration. And thanks a lot to everybody who's stayed here for, who came today. And we look forward to working with you, carry on the work that Neil did, not just in politics, but, in history, in archaeology, and in friendships as well. So we've all got your names and addresses and emails. As I can't remember which film it was, you can run, but you can't hide. We'll let you know what's happening with future events around Neil, whether it's a physical event at Houseman's Bookshop or the books of collected writings, or simply actually just working with anti-capitalist resistance, as Neil would have liked us to do. And whether you are an ACR or not, working with others on the left for a change of society, for an eco-socialist solution to the crisis we face of imperialist war, climate chaos, and mass poverty. So thank you, everybody, again, for staying with us for these 2 hours, and keep in touch. Let's carry on the fight.